The reference here is to, it's in connection with the rule that I just mentioned. So when DOJ and ATF put out this rule a couple of years ago, DOJ also put out this fact sheet. And in this fact sheet, you see the very first question, just a couple of lines to refer to the question is, what is a ghost gun? As I just said, another term for it is a privately made firearm, PMF. It's often called a quote ghost gun, unquote, because it is not marked with a serial number and is therefore far more difficult for law enforcement to trace if it is used to commit a crime. Individuals can make PMS from scratch, or they can buy weapons, parts kits, including, quote, buy, build, shoot kits, unquote. So that ability and increase in the manufacture of PMS, aka ghost guns, is what's being addressed by this bill, by S209. The idea of the language in the bill is that it prohibits, right, a couple of different things. Prohibits the manufacture, sale, transfer, or possession of a firearm or a firearm frame or receiver that doesn't have a serial number, right? So you can't possess it, can't transfer it, can't manufacture if it doesn't have the serial number, and that also is contained in federal law, just so you know, so that's parallel state produced.
I just have two quick questions. So one, I thought we passed a law last year disallowing firearms without serial numbers. Am I misremembering?
No, that actually, it was close, but that prohibited defacing.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't the actual possession, it was the defacing.
Okay, and then I see that there's sort of is the official definition of a ghost gun any privately manufactured gun without a serial number? I'm just trying to understand the legal definition of that terminology.
I don't think there is a legal definition of that terminology. It's more of a term that is sometimes used to describe a privately made firearm. Now, that's not to say you can't create.
Ghost gun is not the term that's used anywhere in the law.
Oh, okay. So that's more of a colloquial.
Colloquial.
Okay.
Yes, that's the word I was, of course, thank you.
I think the term is unserialized.
Okay.
Yes, unserialized firearm, privately made firearm, ghost gun, sort of refer to the same
Okay,
concept.
and it's specifically a privately made serial or privately made gun without a serial number. Someone could still make a gun that was serialized and it would be fine.
Correct.
Okay.
Senator.
Thank you, Eric. So let me know if my understanding of this bill is too simplified, but is the essence of this making it so that the federal law is that we're also creating a state law that mirrors the federal law so that it's enforceable on the state level?
Partially. The part that I just described, I would say that's accurate. Yes.
And can you just one more time highlight what the differences are between this and what the federal law is? Or where I can just.
We haven't quite got to that yet.
Yeah, okay,
So the big distinction's coming up, but the part that I just described, which is just that the possession, transfer, manufacture of a firearm or a firearm frame or receiver without a serial number, that part is covered in federal law. So that is illegal in federal law. This makes it, as you said, Senator Sheen, illegal as a matter of state law, so it can be enforced by state's attorneys and state courts as well.
Okay.
Second piece, though, is not, at least arguably, not covered under federal law at the moment. And this has to do with not just a frame or receiver, but you'll see when we get to this terminology, what's known as an unfinished frame or receiver. Okay, now that's referring to the concept is that it's a firearms component and it's at a stage in the manufacturing process where it's partially manufactured. Not completely manufactured, it's partially manufactured. And so it's not a frame or receiver that's fully manufactured yet. Partially manufactured, and the terminology that's used, and it's used in these types of statutes elsewhere, is that it's reached a stage where it can be readily completed or readily converted into a frame or receiver of a functional firearm.
Not that I understand how they do it, but it's a 3D printer that has produced, the one that I saw in the sheriff, my local office was a couple of teenagers in Dorset had used a 3D printer and produced a gun. revolver that had room for a magazine. They hadn't gotten the magazine yet. So is that would that be covered?
That could be a good example of exactly that. Yes, that someone used a 3D printer. They don't produce yet a fully completed, fully manufactured frame or receiver, but they produce some of the parts for it. And they can be
And then-
put together.
Then they can buy the receiver. There's no requiring that when you buy the magazine, right?
That it be serialized to be?
Yeah,
No, I don't think so.
and there's no requirement on a switch that would make it more automatic. Because I understand on the 3D printer, there's producing a switch.
Yeah, I don't think that's covered under the current language, but it could be.
So the 3D printer didn't have any, there's just a revolver. Or like the figure 4 on page 2, which are examples.
Right. And I would just add that not only the 3D printer example that you mentioned, Sears, but the assembly kits. It's another example that might be covered by the unfinished frame or receiver language, because you got these kits with these different parts in them that can be easily put together, but they're not fully manufactured or assembled yet. So I think that's another example of what that unfinished frame or receiver concept is trying to address.
My motivation in the bill was the criminal activity that goes along with building these. Not necessarily somebody that's building, manufacturing firearm on their own, but the criminal activity and how much of that goes on. So just to make clear, personally, my motivation, the criminal activity that's going on with these, there's no requirement of the background check or anything else, as I understand it.
I have a question. So as I'm reading through this, is this possession of these parts or sale of these parts?
Both.
Both. And if I have these parts that are unserialized, is there a process in which I could get them serialized?
That segues me very nicely right into the next concept.
Why don't you go to the next-
You're welcome.
Next section of the bill.
Yeah, I mentioned that it covered the prohibition on the, you're mentioning as well, Senator Whitehouse, possession, transfer, sale of not only the frames and receivers, but the unfinished frames and receivers. And the other thing that the bill does is that it establishes a process for someone to get a serial number imprinted upon an unserialized component that they have, frame or receiver. It establishes an ability of FFLs, federal firearms licensees, to be able to imprint a serial number on a part if a person goes in and asks them to do it. And they have a similar process in federal law. That's another analog that you were mentioning, Senator Hashim. So there is also a process in federal law, but this explicitly makes it a part of state law as well, so that someone can bring so they wouldn't be illegally possessing something at the time that this law passed. You might also notice, sort of in conjunction with that the bill has a delayed effective date of January 1st, 2024. And the idea of that was if someone happens to have something now that's not serialized, that would have to be under the law, it gives them time to get it serialized before it would be illegal. That's
24. We're in 24.
oh, sorry, 25. I hope.
The
Let me
bill
double check
says
that.
24, you're making it retroactive.
Oh, yeah, thanks for spotting that typo. So this would have been effective, 3 weeks ago? So that 4 on line 17, page 8 should be a 5.
Yeah.
That's my time travel attempt drafting legislations.
Well, you could make it December 31st.
Yes, it's totally, yes,
24, not after.
that's true. That's a policy call for the committee as to how much time might be helpful.
Well, I think the extra day won't matter.
It's
Right.
a holiday anyways.
Yeah.
True.
I just had a couple other clarifying questions, and this is sort of late. So I understand that this is nice to have a delay for people to go through this process. How would we navigate a situation, and maybe you don't know, where someone prints it and is in the process of going through this process even after, or are they just no longer allowed to do that? Do you know what, like there's this window where I might have an unserialized thing that I've made or bought that I'm gonna go get serialized, but in the interim, while I'm getting it serialized, I'm in violation of this law.
Well, amazingly, you segued me again. Right to another point, so I was,
We didn't plan this.
I know, not at all, not at all. The bill contains
I'm
several
confused where
exceptions.
we are right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna refer us now to page 4.
Thank you.
Let's go right to the language that covers the prohibitions that we've been discussing. So if you look sort of big picture for a second, page 4 and 5, subsection A of page 4, which starts on line 3, I believe. And then that covers one element of the prohibited conduct, and that's the possession, transfer, et cetera, of unfinished frames of receivers. See, so that's covered in subsection A, line 4, unfinished frames of receivers. Subsection B, just so you know, is covering the finished frames of receivers, so you can't transfer, and these are items without serial numbers. That's B. And C over on the next page, when we get to it, covers the manufacturing, including three-dimensional printing. So these are the 3 types of conduct that are prohibited. But Senator Wachowski was indicating a point which is covered in one of the exceptions, which starts on line 7. There are some exceptions carved out. First one, subdivision A, means a federal firearms licensee acting within their license, scope of their license. Now that there are some exceptions in federal law as well for the serialization requirement. So if a person is acting within their license and they're covered by one of these exceptions, for example, that's not going to be a violation. But subdivision 2 is the key one here, which is that temporary possession or transfer of an unfinished frame or receiver for the purpose of having it imprinted with a serial number is not a violation. So if you're kind of in the process and you're bringing it over there, or you're intending to, that's the idea, is that that language covers that situation.
Just out of curiosity, which state did we use as a model? Is it Washington or Colorado?
But I use some of both. Some of both. Thank you for that.
So
That
this
is
is not the California law.
correct. Well, there could be some similarities. I didn't look at the California law post, so.
Well, we never used California as an example.
Rarely, much more often Washington, Colorado.
Good.
And I should add too that I think there's in the neighborhood of 12 or 13 other states that have passed these types of laws at the moment. But those are the 2 that I was looking at when I was
Well, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't mistaken, that we didn't use California law.
right.
I have one other question, and I know this has come up in some other conversations about antiques that aren't serialized. Will those now need to become serialized?
No,
Okay.
thank you. Again,
You're welcome.
Turn over on the top of page 5. And
Have
this
you read
is.
this book?
I
Right.
Antiques are always.
This is like the 5th time I've segued Eric, it's like we planned this.
Yeah, like a choreographed,
Yes.
but it's great minds think alike. So.
It's almost like Eric set you up for this now.
I know.
Just amazed at how you're.
It was unintentional, but a happy coincidence. So that leads to some of the exceptions to the possession prohibition. So generally speaking, you're not supposed to possess frame, receiver, or firearm that doesn't have a serial number. What are the exceptions? The first 2 are the same as the 2 that we just already looked at. Starts at the bottom of page 4, goes on at the top of page 5. The licensee is acting within the scope of their license, or the temporary possession issue. So those are the same, but the additionals are C, D, and E lines 4 through 6. Antique firearm is the first one. Second one is a firearm that's been rendered permanently inoperable. So again, it's not operating at all permanently, not temporarily. And lastly, E is a firearm that was manufactured before 1968. And the reason that that's there is because you may recall that I mentioned that it was the Gun Control Act of 1968 that first made it legally required that serial numbers be on firearms. Prior to that time, and in fact, the Gun Control Act specifically contains similar language that it doesn't apply to firearms that were manufactured pre-1968. Those don't have to have serial numbers. So the exemption here parallels the federal law exemption as well.
Just out of curiosity, so 68 was more than 50 years ago. Is that the frame for an antique? What there's an antique, how old?
I think it was much older than that, and I can't recall the specific date, but I think it was 19th century. It might have been 18th.
Okay,
So I almost,
not,
1868.
not the,
Yeah,
Well,
oddly, exactly 100 years prior to the Control Act.
yeah, okay, easy to remember.
Yeah, that's right, right, also a coincidence, I assume. So that covers, the firearms, frames and receivers, both the, unfinished and finished. Subsection C, which is over also on page 5, addresses manufacturing. So again, it says you can't manufacture a firearm or a frame or receiver that's not imprinted with a serial number. This is another example of Senator Hashim where it parallels federal law. So that piece also exists in federal law. That was part of the Gun Control Act 1968. But it does specify to, not that it might not arguably covered by federal law, but it's expressed line 8, including a three-dimensional printer. So this is expressed here that the manufacturer includes manufacture by a three-dimensional printer. Again,
I'm sorry, was that one of the differences between ours and versus the federal law?
I didn't see, it may be there, I didn't see that expressed in federal law, but it's possible that it's somewhere and I missed it. So that's at least an intent to be explicit about something that we're not
is there
sure.
anything here that prohibits that trigger? The one that I sent you a Boston Globe article.
Yeah.
What's been going on in the underworld, where they're able to produce these firearms and then have a trigger switch that allows the firearm to be used more like a machine gun.
I don't think that this addresses that particular situation, at least not clearly. So while perhaps an argument could
We
be
can go
made,
back to that Globe article and make sure that, see what Massachusetts is doing. I believe it was Massachusetts. Maybe
Yeah,
some of the
right.
witnesses know.
yeah, I think you're
But
right.
I'm particularly concerned where you can use. What's happened in my county, quite frankly, is that the gun shops are becoming more aware and they're doing a better job of filtering out some of the criminal element that are trying to buy guns for drugs. And so they've stopped a lot of those sales. And so that's forced a lot of these people, as I understand it. I'm not into that. I don't, it's not personal. It's from people in Bennington County law enforcement. So what's happened is a lot more people are using unserialized firearms to trade that they can get either out of kits or 3D printers, trade those for drugs, rather than trying to go through the federally licensed firearms. So that's why I want to make sure that people understand the motivation, number one. I think it's seen as something of one of these, one more liberal gun grabs. And it's certainly not my motivation, but secondly, I want to make sure that whatever needs to be done to curtail that trigger switch that's become, that they've seen in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'll follow up, take a look at that language, to understand.
Thank you. Senator Bob.
Thank you. To your point about people being able to manufacture these without going through the background check, in the process of getting the gun serialized, is there a background check component? So if I take it in to get a serial number, do I then need to go through a background check to do that?
It is, we'll get to that and it's,
Let's transfer it back.
Could you hold that?
yes.
I'm sorry.
The
Yes.
next section.
It's when it's when it's returned, not when you bring it in, but when it's returned.
Okay.
Yes, that's when they have to do a background check, exactly. And that actually is a distinction with the federal law, or the federal proposal, I should say. They interestingly require a background check when it's returned to somebody else, but if it's returned to the person who brings it in, returned to the same person, then that's not a very big pressure required.
Interesting.
So this ATF guidance on that. So. Haven't talked about the penalty yet, so that's the next thing. That's the bottom of page 5. It's a quick summary of what that is, but so line 14, for first offense, the 1 year misdemeanor, the maximum 1 year imprisonment, $500. Second offense, subdivision B, 2-year misdemeanor. Third or subsequent offense is a 3-year felony. Over onto the next page, you see, this kind of gets at the point that Senator Sears made of this, it's being used in crimes. So if you use an unserialized firearm while committing a felony, then it gets bumped up to a 5-year. That becomes a 5-year felony.
So Eric, quick question, is that one place that you mentioned on page 5, line 9, or I'm sorry, line 8? Is that the only mention of 3D printers in the bill?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay, so, by including it there and having a definition, we are prohibiting creation of unserialized firearms with, so there have been previous iterations of ghost gun bills that prohibited the creation of any gun, use it whether it's serialized or not, with 3D printers, by prohibiting the instructions that the 3D printer would use. So this doesn't get at that. This just frames it within the context of serial numbers.
Correct, that's right.
If you produce, this is where I think people have noticed what we've tried to do here. If you produce the gun and you're legally doing it, you get a serial number, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It's the avoidance of the background check and the use of these firearms in criminal activity that's trying to be dealt with here.
And that was
I
my,
realize it will cause something, inconvenient.
yeah,
But as I said, what we've seen more and more is the federally licensed firearm dealers doing a better job of keeping the firearms. I know there was a case where there was a car, an out-of-state car. In-state guy goes into the firearm dealer in town. Wants to buy some revolvers. Handguns. And guy says no. Because he realizes this is just, certified these guns to trade for the drugs. So once you kind of curtail that, then they go to the next step, which is to get some serialized firearm and avoid all of that.
yeah, I was just basically making that point you just made, which is this is a much lighter touch on
Yeah.
3D printing than some of the others I've seen.
Yeah, it doesn't ban it. It's if you're gonna do it, then follow the rules.
Enter the process after you create the unserialized gun by taking it to the dealer.
I'm not a 3D printing expert, and maybe none of us are at the table, but what are the materials you can 3D print in? Because one of the things that concerns me about
I
3D
don't
printing
have a
is,
clue.
okay. Well, so one of the things that gives me pause about 3D printing is that those guns may then be able to be carried through like a metal detector without setting it off, because they're maybe not metal. I don't know though, maybe you can 3D print in metal. Because I'm, like I said, not a 3D printing expert.
The only ones I saw were plastic.
Okay,
That wouldn't have, that the frame itself wouldn't have set off the. I'm sure the X-ray in the airport would have probably given the away as a fire, but it wouldn't have set off the alarm.
yeah, and maybe we can hear from someone who has more
Yeah, I think we've got
understanding
some
of.
witnesses more technical.
Perfect.
Yes, I'll defer to them.
Yeah, let's deal with the question,
Yeah,
so the technical question.
I remember working my way through college, working in a injection molding place, making clock frames on plastic. And that was pretty easy, and that was 50 years ago. So I assume that it's not too hard to make a 3D plastic.
Or reminds me that in the line of fire, where that buggy switch on off of it, I think you made it out of plastic or fired out of plastic.
Anyway,
Hollywood reference.
we're at the point where you, and we just covered the crime, the penalties, which, we may want up or down, or whatever, I believe these will apply.
Yeah, similar to those, exactly, yeah. And you added the felony pieces added here.
The important one is the use of unserialized firearms in the commission of assault. We may want more than 5.
My question about the penalties is, are they kind of in line with other penalties in Vermont law?
Yes, I tracked the firearm stuff that you've been doing over the last few years to have them be within the range of those as well. Yeah.
The only one I'm on page 6, number 2, the use of developing.
So the next section is the topic of creating a process for someone to have a federal firearms license, put a serial number on a firearm or a frame or receiver or component that doesn't have it. So establishing authority in law, again, it's a may, look at line 6, page 6, it's not a requirement. FFLs don't have to do it, but they may choose to do it. The details of the process are then described in the rest of the page over on the next page. It details what information has to be in the serial number and the imprint, how it should appear on the firearm. And this is consistent with federal law. I should point out here that there's a provision in the Code of Federal Regulations that details similar requirements for serial numbers under federal law. So this is based on a lot of that language.
I'm sure you already looked into this, but is there any federal preemption issue with state telling federal licensees what they can do with their job?
It's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I don't think so, but I can follow up on that as well. I know we've done it before with, for example, the universal background check, for example, not required under federal law, but you're required under state law now, and I didn't prepare for the preemption. I think it's a parallel situation. Yeah, sure. Subdivision 2 starts at the bottom of page 6, goes over on top of page 7. This is some record keeping. What must if the licensee does participate in this program? What are the record keeping requirements do they have to satisfy? And those have to comply with federal records required for firearm sales. They'll do the same kind of thing. Also have to keep records of the date, name, age, residence of the person to whom the item is transferred, as well as the unique serial number that's printed on it. Subsection C goes to the background check issue that Senator Bahowski brought up earlier. So this deals with when does this background check have to be conducted, and that is that Ruth mentioned it's when the firearm is returned to the person. So it specifically provides that returning it after it has been serialized does constitute a transfer that requires a background check. So that's expressed. Licensee conducts the check, and then you see lines 8 and 9. If the transfer is denied, so in other words, they do the check and like, oh wait, the person comes up, with either a disqualifying conviction or something else that would disqualify the person from legally possessing it, then the licensee surrenders it to local law enforcement agencies.
So if I could just ask about the mechanism there. So does the FFL dealer keep the firearm like a in a liquor store, if you use a fake ID, they keep it if they determine that it's fake? Or this is a little ambiguous. It says the licensee shall surrender the firearm, frame, or receiver to a law enforcement agency. Does that mean the FFL dealer says, I can't do it, didn't pass the background check? Do they then give it to them and say you have to put this to a law enforcement agency? Or is the responsibility on the FFL to get it to the law enforcement agency?
I think the intent is the latter, but
It kind of doesn't read that way.
yeah, like surrender maybe language in that sentence that could be typed up to get assuming that is the intent.
Right, so
The storage law we did back where the
Right,
firearms stored it.
yeah,
or RFAs. It's in the connection with relief from abuse orders, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
in that case, you had possession of the weapon never going back to the person who brought it in. Here, it sounds like, oh, I see. Okay, well, maybe it is clearer.
Well, just let's check to make sure
Yeah.
they're consistent with what the RFAs.
Yeah,
Mhm.
But a person can get the firearms back an RA,
Yeah, if they go through the permitting here.
RFA.
Right, when the order is no longer in effect.
Right.
It's supposed to.
So if you could check to make sure that that's consistent with that law.
Yeah.
So that should that be a mistake or something, just get it back. Possible the federal government made a mistake.
And so lastly, you see there's a penalty attached here to subsection D that's consistent with the penalty for background check violations. It's also already in state law. It's a 1-year misdemeanor. If the licensee participates in this program, but that violates some of the requirements that I just mentioned.
Sorry, one more question. So the licensee surrenders the firearm to a law enforcement agency. It's sort of silent on what happens to it after that. So am I to understand that they now own the weapon and can dispose of it? Or is there some expectation that they're storing it? And if the person cured their background check problem, they would get it back?
That's an interesting question that I had not contemplated or addressed by the
Yeah.
language here. So it's an interesting.
One of the things we did was allow auction sale of seized firearms.
Yes.
Well, I would,
And you obviously couldn't
Yeah.
sell this because it doesn't have a serial number.
right. So,
Or it does have a serial number,
but the background check,
but a background check fails. So yeah, it does have a serial number.
yeah. Yeah, I don't want us to get into the business of either storing weapons or auctioning them or,
Well, we are.
reselling them. I know that, I don't want to add to that.
Okay.
Process. But,
I'll let you work on that piece.
yeah,
But we are selling.
understood. And to get rid of the storage problem.
Right.
Yeah, this neatly evades those questions, so maybe it's better left as is, but, I do wonder what happens when the law enforcement agency has this done, what is the intent for them to do that?
Right.
Yeah.
You certainly could, in theory, cross-reference that section Title 20 that
Yeah.
establishes the sale process for firearms that aren't
Yeah,
claimed. by-
it does now have a serial.
Right, right.
It's just a background check.
Mhm.
So, gotta be different.
Okay,
What do we do with other, well, never mind. What section? Is there any more questions on section 2 of the bill? Concerns before we get to the transfer from the visitors.
Just for a moment before we go to the transfer, I just wanted to note a couple of points about legal status of the types of statutes that you're looking at, just so you know. I'm not gonna go into it in that much detail again. I spent plenty of time last year talking to this committee about the Bruin United States Supreme Court decision and the new standard under the Second Amendment that the court adopted in Bruin that to analyze proposed statutes that dealt with firearms under that test of whether it's consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. I remember that. So, as it happens, you were mentioning, Senator Sheen, that there is a federal prohibition on possession of firearms without serial numbers as well. That's been challenged. That's been subject to some federal court litigation under the new Bruin standard. There may be more decisions than I've seen. I've seen 3 decisions come out at the federal trial court level. Of those 3, 2 upheld it. 2 upheld the serialization requirement under Bruin. 1 struck it down, similar to what we saw last year that some courts did, some didn't. What's different this year? Well, first of all, interesting. The one that struck it down is pending before the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals, and actually just this week decided to hear that en banc. I mean, all the judges in the court give argument on that case. But also interestingly, you may remember I mentioned this last year. We talked about this a lot. That given that lack of clarity in the Bruin standard, and it seemed like it was going to be necessary for the United States Supreme Court to step back in relatively quickly and articulate this. Well, that's exactly what happened. And the Supreme Court granted cert. And another case this past year, that had to do with domestic violence restraining orders, which the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had struck those down under the Bruin standard. And the US Supreme Court, somewhat unusual for it to revisit a topic that quickly, I think, in all likelihood, recognizing that there's some clarity that needs to happen as to how that standard needs to be articulated. And in fact, they had oral arguments on that case in November, first week of November. So should have a decision on that hopefully by June, and we'll have more guidance on.
Hopefully we'll be out of your budget.
Right. So, and one very last thing, the rule I mentioned that I referred to, depicted in the picture of the firearms receivers and also the DOJ fact sheet, that rule is also subject to litigation. It's not under Bruin, but it's just out there to say.
I just want to say, this is where I have a hard time. Could the founding fathers have ever envisioned a 3D printer?
Yeah. It's hard
How do you
hard to
know
imagine.
what they might have done
Right. Right.
250 years ago?
Right.
And it's even worse than that in a way, because it's not even what they could imagine, it's just what was in place as a restriction or a custom or a tradition. So whether or not they might have been able to imagine or think something, if they didn't act at that time, then we can't act at this time with some minor changes. But that's the problem that I have with Bruin overall is I understand that it wants to respect and use as a guide custom and tradition. But on the technology side, it acknowledges that technology has advanced and evolved. And it says that those evolutions are still covered, even though they weren't in the founding period. But when it comes to regulation, advances and evolutions aren't covered, even though they weren't in the founding period. So in other words, custom and tradition protects a gun that couldn't have been imagined back then. But in terms of regulation, you can't go beyond what they were willing to do back then. And that just seems to me like a recipe for a completely unregulated and deadly environment in a modern society. So I'm glad they're revisiting and we'll see where they go.
Yeah. So Eric, go ahead.
Yes, briefly on section 3, will probably look familiar to you because it passed this committee last year in S4, and then passed the Senate in S4 as well. But ultimately, what was signed by the governor in Act 23 did not include that. And what it does is it expands the Big 12 by 4 offenses. Those 4 offenses are over on page 8. Remember, the Big 12 are offenses that when they're committed by a person currently 18 years of age or under, slated to be 19 years of age or under, potentially July 1st this year under the raise the age provision. But currently, a person 18 years of age or under commits one of these offenses. The proceeding has to start in the criminal division as opposed to the family division. That's the Big 12. This proposes 4 offenses to be added to the Big 12: carrying a firearm while committing a felony, trafficking or regulated drug, human trafficking or aggravated human trafficking, and aggravated stalking. And as I say, essentially, it's just passing the same language that passes committee.
Can I suggest for the effective dates, section 2 be effective 12/31/24, section 3 be effective 7/1/24? Or you might have wanted to reverse those.
No, I think you were right, Senator Sears. You want the delayed effective date for the serialization.
Right.
Yep. So that would be December 31st, 24.
Yep.
And the Big 12, July 1st.
July.
Okay.
Senator Sears, I'm not remembering, with S4, did this come out in the back and forth between the chambers?
The House refused to accept any of it.
Yeah,
The only thing the House accepted was the attempt language and the updating of the current 12.
Yeah.
To include like aggravated sexual assault, which wasn't in law back in when originally did it, I think it was 74. They did that. I think 12.
Yeah, I'm not sure the date, but you're right, it didn't include, the aggravated events didn't exist at that time, so they weren't in the original statute.
But they would not accept and particularly important to me, and I think to you as well, is carrying a firearm while committing a felony. That's, to me, one of the critical ones, because that's what we're seeing going on in our communities. More so than some of the other behaviors, but the other behaviors are there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for Eric. Talking about the ping pong effect on this bill. We jumped all over the place as we started asking questions. It's a two-part question. Maybe you're not the person to ask on the second part. We've covered a lot of things, so just hypothetically understand what our forefathers may have wanted and done so before back at that time. But in your opinion, Eric, what is the intent of this bill? Please explain this to me. What does the bill do? Okay, and does it infringe upon any Second Amendment rights whatsoever, in your opinion?
Oh, was that the two-part question?
No, that's
part one.
Part one, A, B, and C.
Right. Well, I think the intent of the bill is, as I explained, going to that part of your question first.
Yep.
To prohibit the use of unserialized firearms components in order to make sure that those types of products aren't put out in the stream of commerce. I think that's the intent. Senator Sears being sponsor, I'll defer to him on some of what the intent is as well. So that's more of a sponsor question than a legislative council question. But that's my view of sort of the intent of the legal language.
Yeah, that's true. It's correct. As I, spent some time this summer and fall talking with law enforcement, the two major communities in my district, Bennington and Manchester. The concern was that after seeing more of these, talking to the sheriff's department as well, and trying to make sure that those that are possessed are legal and have gone through a background check, and that they're not being used in criminal activity. You start seeing firearms from Vermont being used in Massachusetts criminal activity. My antenna goes up and says, wait, so we've been known for trading guns for drugs.
Second part of your question.
No, quite, let's go back to the first part.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Actually, I wanted your intent of the bill, and in your opinion, what does this bill do? I know there's intent, but what does this bill do?
Okay, so what it does as a matter of the practical effect of the bill, maybe is
Yes.
kind of what you're getting at? Yeah, so it establishes under Vermont law, the ability of a Vermont state's attorney to go to a Vermont court and file a criminal charge against somebody for possessing a firearm or a firearm frame or receiver or an unfinished frame or receiver that doesn't have a serial number. Right now, at least with respect to that first group of items, the firearm and frame or receiver, Vermont state attorney couldn't bring that charge because that is maybe illegal under federal law, but that would have to be brought by a U.S. attorney in federal court. So this allows a Vermont state's attorney to bring a criminal charge in Vermont based on that. On the unfinished piece, it's a little unclear under federal law right now because of this pending litigation, but clearly establishes the ability for Vermont state to bring a charge against somebody for, Vermont's criminal court for possessing, transferring, manufacturing a component of a firearm that could be readily transferred, readily converted to a functional frame receiver.
So, and I'm getting toward the end here.
Yeah, no.
So it doesn't say that an individual cannot manufacture a firearm. What it does say is, if in fact they choose to do that, it must have a serial number attached to it. Is that what the bill says? And this doesn't prevent them from doing anything about making a firearm, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, so the second my second question.
Yes.
And I don't know, who sells these components? Do they get them in the mail? Are these legal entities that sell these things? And if so, why aren't they required to have the serial numbers on the frame prior to being shipped?
I think under federal law, they're supposed to put fire alarm, but the manufacturers are required to put the serial numbers on them, but some people don't. That's, I think as to who's doing this, you might have a better sense from witnesses, but I think there are some people who are either using their 3D printers at home or other ways that I may not be familiar with, but people are trying to avoid that
We have
requirement.
witnesses that can answer.
And I'm sure someone can elaborate on that, yes. Thank you.
Did you have anything else, Senator?
I'm all set, thank you.
Senator Booth and Senator?
I just wanted to make the point, my memory of S4 is that it had a piece that criminalized defacing a serial number.
Right.
Seems to me this continues that work, where it's saying you can't get rid of serial numbers and you can't refuse to have a serial number. Every gun has to have a serial number and they all have to go through background checks. So we're trying to we're still in the process of closing loopholes for guns that are unregulated or on background check. And so it seems to me this is the companion piece for that piece in S4 is just making sure that we're covered in the modern realm when you can go on the internet and you can get a frame without a serial number. This is making sure that that's an illegal act and they can be prosecuted.
And just a quick follow-up if I might.
Sure.
And I agree with serial numbers on
Yeah.
on fire. Don't get me wrong. But having said that, looking under S4 and the House bill that came in here in reference to if someone's allowed to manufacture a gun, get a serial number, when or where does that 72-hour waiting period come in? The 3-day waiting period that we passed.
They gotta get a background check.
So that's when it's gonna kick in. It doesn't mention that. So they have to have a background check, but does that include
Well,
everything?
it mentions it when it's transferred back to them,
But is there a 72-hour waiting period on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
because that's how our background checks work.
So,
I will loop that in.
If that's upheld. Okay. We don't know. I believe Colorado, gun rights group has already challenged the Colorado 3-day waiting period. And I believe we have a challenge in Vermont to the 3-day waiting period. Senator Sheen, final question.
This might be a question for the state's attorney, but I'm looking at the exceptions on page 4, where specifically B, where it's talking about temporary possession for the purpose of having it imprinted with a serial number. Is that? I mean, I guess this is more of a comment. It just seems really easy to use that exception. I mean, somebody is in possession of one of these and it doesn't have a serial number. Really, all they have to say to law enforcement is, I'm planning to get a serial number on it, and regardless of whether they are or aren't, and the exception applies. Is that, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Well, just that ordinarily, there would need to be some sort of evidence to support the assertion. So that an assertion with nothing else would seem to be a difficult one to make. But you make a fair point that I think you do want to make sure that the language is tight enough to cover what you're intending to cover, which is someone who genuinely is intending to have it serialized. So if you think that the language maybe doesn't do that, that's a fair point to think about and consider whether it might be more tailored to make sure it's addressing that situation.
Any other questions for Eric? Eric, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your work.
Absolutely.
Our next witness is Greg Whittenhoff. Technical advisor to every town. You have a copy of this testimony, or at least I don't know if it's testimony or Craig, you can tell us what we've got. We all have a document from you.
Yes, that's correct. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I have submitted a written testimony with helpful images in it. I also would love to read a shortened version if that's okay with. Okay. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here to testify in regards to the unserialized firearms portion of the bill. My name is Greg Lickenbrock, and I'm the Senior Firearms Analyst for Everytown for Gun Safety, the country's largest gun violence prevention organization. I serve as Everytown's technical advisor and gun expert. Before joining Everytown in 2020, I spent a decade working in the gun industry as a magazine editor, which gave me the opportunity to test hundreds of firearms, attend media events and training courses, and meet people working at every level of the firearms industry, from CEOs and vice presidents to marketing professionals and engineers, including those who knew that unserialized firearms, or ghost guns, were a way to skirt regulations when they were first introduced. Since 1968, as Eric mentioned, the Federal Gun Control Act, or GCA, has required licensed gun makers to engrave or imprint serial numbers on their weapons as frames or receivers, the basic building blocks of every firearm. The law also requires that gun makers and dealers log those serial numbers of the firearms that enter and leave their inventories. In this way, when a gun is recovered from a crime scene, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, can trace the gun back to its first point of sale. They will contact the manufacturer or check their records and begin tracing the gun through the supply chain down to the dealer. Since 1993, federal law has also required that licensed dealers perform background checks on potential customers in most situations. But in recent years, dozens of companies found a way around those federal regulations to sell gun parts and do-it-yourself kits online and at gun shows that make it easy for anyone, including those prohibited from owning firearms, to build their own unserialized and thus untraceable firearms at home in minutes. Most ghost guns today are built using so-called 80% complete frames and receivers. And if you have the document, there's a picture of it there. These frames and receivers are sold with jigs, instructions, and even drill bits so that they can be finished quickly and without any specialized training. More importantly, these unfinished frames and receivers lack serial numbers, and until recently, the gun industry maintained that they did not have to be sold or transferred through licensed dealers with accompanying background checks. Of course, the 80% moniker is itself misleading, as these firearm components are nearly finished. The largest manufacturer and distributor in this market, Polymer 80, produces so-called 80% frames for Glock-style pistols that can be completed by simply drilling out 2 holes and removing 5 plastic tabs, as shown in the image I provided. Once that is done, other parts such as the slide and trigger of the gun can be added to complete it. The rise of 3D printing, as we mentioned earlier, has also created another avenue for criminals to obtain untraceable firearms. While guns can be completely 3D printed in plastic, like the single-shot 22 caliber Liberator pistol that captured headlines in 2013, today it's more common for people to build sturdier firearms by 3D printing the frames and receivers and then adding metal components made by established gun companies. The 3D printers, materials, and gun parts are all readily available online. Predictably, ghost guns have emerged as the weapons of choice for criminals, gun traffickers, and those legally prohibited from buying firearms, leading to a steep increase in the number of ghost guns recovered from crime scenes in recent years. I provided a chart to show that. The ATF estimates that between 2016 and 2022, law enforcement personnel recovered approximately 71,000 unserialized crime guns in the US alone. And that is an undercount. That is only when law enforcement recovers a ghost gun and then reports it to the ATF.
Sorry to break off, just informationally. So when you give that statistic, does that include defaced weapons that had a serial number?
No. When the ATF provided that, it was in the ghost gun rule related to unserialized as in produced without a serial number.
Got it, thank you.
Ghost guns have also been used in mass shootings. They've armed far-right extremists and led to gunfire on school grounds in places like Arizona, Kansas, Maryland, and New Mexico. Sorry. We've also seen them show up here in cases tied to criminal activity in Vermont as well, including in Rutland and Bennington. As Eric mentioned, in May 2021, the ATF proposed a new rule to end the proliferation of ghost guns. The rules sought to shutter most of the ghost gun market by clarifying the regulatory definitions of firearm and frame or receiver to include ghost gun kits, as well as standalone components like the nearly complete frames and receivers. The finalized rule went into effect in August 2022, correcting the ATF's previous interpretations of federal law. Since 1968, the federal definition of firearm has included complete firearms, those that may be readily completed, and the core building blocks of firearms, including the frames and receivers. The ATF rule makes clear that parts kits that are readily convertible to functional weapons or functional frames and receivers of weapons are subject to the same regulations as traditional firearms, meaning they must be serialized and sold with an accompanying background check. In determining when a firearm is nearly complete, the ATF can look at several factors, including the time it takes to finish the frame or receiver, the ease of doing so, and the equipment required. The ATF will also consider the jigs, templates, molds, equipment, tools, or instructions, and a whole list of other things, as well as the company's marketing materials, and determining if they're selling a frame and receiver. Since the rule's enactment, gun groups and ghost gun sellers, including Polymer 80, which I mentioned earlier, have filed lawsuits against the ATF and Department of Justice in an attempt to stop the rule from being implemented, which is why S209 is so critical. These lawsuits allege that the ATF rule infringes upon the Second Amendment, and that the ATF, the agency tasked with enforcing gun serialization and sales requirements that have been on the books since the GCA was passed in 1968, does not have the authority to promulgate the rule. Currently, the U.S. Supreme Court has allowed the rule to remain in effect while the challenges work their way through the courts. While the rule is being litigated, 80% of frames and receivers can still be found online, as with the jigs required to complete them. And some ghost gun sellers have shifted to offering 3D printing files that you can download and plug into your 3D printer for the frames and receivers, and then they'll sell all the other components you need for the gun separately. Today, the gun industry as a whole continues to support this dangerous trend.
Can I ask, I hate to interrupt
No,
your
absolutely.
testimony, but if you don't mind. That is counterintuitive to me. If I'm Smith and Wesson or any of the major gun manufacturers, why would I want this competition? Why would I support this competition?
That's a very good question, Senator. So many gun makers sell the rest of the parts for the firearm, the top half of the gun, if you will, the triggers, things like that. They'll sell those through distributors so that people can ostensibly repair their firearms or build new ones if they already have a frame or receiver. So they still win at the end. Yes, ma'am.
As a follow-up to that, are those parts? I'm like proprietary, do they only go with the 3D print? So I buy the 3D printed file and then I can only buy the parts from the person who I bought the 3D printed file from, or is it more universal than
It's,
that?
so it depends on the firearm,
Okay,
but 3D printers in general, they like to take apart an already established gun, design the frame or receiver files for 3D printing, and then sell the rest of the parts online.
mhm.
And then they usually distribute the 3D printing file for free.
Oh, okay,
Is what makes it so dangerous. Yeah, that answers your question.
yes, it does, thank you.
Thank you, I'm sorry to.
No, that's fine. I'll just finish very briefly here. Thankfully, 13 states and Washington DC have passed legislation to curb ghost guns. In general, these laws prohibit unserialized firearms and components and establish serialization requirements, just like S209. Some also prohibit undetectable firearms and 3D printing in general. The provisions of S209 that regulate ghost guns are smart, well-reasoned, and a win for public safety. And I believe that if enacted, Vermont will join the growing coalition of states that have chosen to stop ghost guns and save lives. Thank you. That is my testimony. If it's okay with the committee, I'd also like to introduce our policy counsel, Elizabeth Ryan, who I believe is on Zoom.
Sure.
She had some comments about the bill itself, and whereas I can answer technical questions about guns, how they're sold, the ATF, et cetera.
Okay, yes. Are there any, but first, are there any questions?
Yeah.
I have one, yes, for Mr. Lick.
Just quickly, I know you mentioned Rutland and Bennington. Well, criminal cases or criminal activity in Vermont, Rutland and Bennington, whatever. So I was looking through your file here as to whether guns were possessed. Are we familiar with any guns that have been repossessed for lack of serial numbers in Vermont? If so, how many?
We're not aware of those numbers. Police departments have those numbers.
Okay, but we do know that in Rutland and Bennington, some of these firearms have been.
Yes, so they were covered in news stories.
Yeah.
That they recovered, ghost guns. In one situation, it was police stopping the car, that they suspected of drug trafficking. Another was a ghost gun dropped at the scene of the shooting. So those are just from news reports, not police records or
The
anything.
one my sheriff had was from a teenagers in Dorset.
So there's no place we can get that information, or
But
there's no place we can get that information? Maybe one of the
I
places.
don't know if my crime research group has those numbers. We can check the Vermont Crime Research Group, that the people that were here yesterday, they have any figures on firearm seizures and particularly on serialized.
Crime Information Center, right? The Crime Information Center.
BCS.
BCS.
Oh, sorry. Is that any other questions? Right?
Thank you.
We're ready for the calendar. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
Good morning. Thank
Sorry,
you.
Elizabeth.
That's okay. My name is Elizabeth Ryan. I am policy counsel with Everytown for Gun Safety. I am focusing on the Northeast states. I'm honored to be able to speak to you. My family roots in Vermont go back at least 3 generations. So thank you very much for having me. I am mostly here to answer any questions that you have about the policy aspect of things. My biggest concern about the substance of the bill was that delay in effective date so that people had a chance to get things serialized, and you've already addressed that. So overall, I just want to say that we are very thankful that Vermont is addressing this. This is a growing problem. I don't have the numbers in front of me in terms of how many have been recovered in Vermont, but we do know that the recovery some federal numbers show that the recovery of ghost guns from 2016 to 2022 increased by 1,300%. So these are, I don't have exact Vermont numbers, but this is absolutely a growing issue nationwide. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have now or later. Please.
Oh, I've got a question on Senator Bohowski. I wonder if there's any way to back up what I said earlier about the intent of the bill through information, and that is that in my area of the state, they're seeing more and more of these ghost guns or unserialized guns used in criminal activity because many of our federally licensed firearm dealers are doing a better job of refusing to sell to drug traffickers. It can't be any more clear to me than that. That's the problem. And is there any information to back that up, or is that just anecdotal?
So I think I don't have any statistics on that off the top of my head. We can consult with our research department, but I think that anecdotally it makes a lot of sense. Vermont has made really great strides in the last few years to shore up their gun violence prevention laws. And I think that it is potentially a natural consequence of that people are having a harder time getting guns in a legitimate way, knowing that they couldn't pass background checks. And so turning to these sorts of guns is a consequence of that. So I think that addressing this would would complete Vermont's, it would help all of the protections you've put in place get finalized.
Senator Bohowski.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit about the content of the bill, but also how it sort of interacts with federal law. If this bill passes and someone is in violation of this bill at state law, were they already in violation of federal law?
So it's in some instances, yes. The issue, like the biggest problem that the reason that these came about is because the federal definition of firearm is fairly limited, as Greg can tell you, more explicitly. Technically, there's a point to which it sort of gets to a point where it's not considered a firearm, and then if you add these small few components, it becomes a firearm. And so these developed as sort of a loophole to get through that definition of firearm, because if it's not a firearm, you don't have to undergo federal background checks. So what's going on right now is that the ATF promulgated a rule that said these are now defined as firearms. And that rule is in place. The Supreme Court affirmatively has allowed it to go forward, but that is now under litigation, being challenged by the fact that the ATF has exceeded its authority in defining firearm like that. So the issue that's sort of hottest in litigation right now is that this should be a legislative fix, not an executive or administrative fix. So that's where Vermont can come in and explicitly fill a hole in federal law with a legislative statutory fix.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Elizabeth? Or for Greg?
If I could just follow up on
Yeah,
that really
please.
quickly. So the ATF rule, again, if it stands, then it would be federal crime in some situations. But the rule also has a few, not necessarily loopholes, but a few weak spots that your bill would, S209 would fill the gap on. Particularly in the federal language, if someone brings an unserialized firearm to an FFL, they will put a serial number on it, they'll enter that into their inventory and then send it, as long as it goes back to that same person that day, that person will not have to undergo a background check. In S209, they would, which is to me, a smart requirement. Another situation, the ATF rule says that an AR-15 lower receiver in particular, if it is an 80% lower receiver that does not have any of the it's not sold with any of the tools that would allow you to complete it, and it's sold without any marks on it that tell you where to drill or anything like that. It is okay on its own. And that's something that we at every town do not like, because it still allows people, you can find jigs and instructions and drill bits and all those things online. So you can buy the AR-15 80% lower receiver, the bottom half of the gun, essentially. Buy that online, go to another outlet to get all the things you need and finish it. And under the ATF size, they believe that an AR-15 lower receiver is slightly harder to finish than, say, a Glock style pistol frame. I believe that's the distinction that they would offer. But with this bill, anything that doesn't have a serial number that is used for a frame receiver would be regulated.
Just wanted to,
I'm sorry. Senator Brooks.
No,
I just wanted to confirm if I'm understanding correctly. So if somebody is in possession of an unfinished receiver and they want to take it to go get it serialized, they'll have to get a background check just for that part of the firearm?
Yes, so in terms of how guns are sold and everything, the frame receiver is the gun in the eyes of the court. So yes, they'd have to get a background check just for that frame receiver.
Thank you.
Thank you. Earlier, I was in discussion with Eric, I was talking about a Boston Globe article with trigger.
Yes,
Are you familiar with?
Yes.
Either of you are familiar with that? Could you comment a little bit on this?
So on the federal level, it is already illegal to produce a machine gun, which, so you're talking about devices that increase the rate of fire of a weapon. In particular, a Glock switch, as it's known, is a little 3-piece unit that you slip onto the back of a Glock. It turns it into a machine gun. The gun fires fully automatically. So under federal regulations, the Glock itself that has been converted would be a machine gun. The piece that you add to it is also a machine gun. So just having one of those is already a felony under the National Firearms Act. So that is one problem that 3D printing has allowed people to create these Glock switches and other auto sears, as they're known, very easily with, again, plastic. 3D printing of metal is generally reserved for larger factories. So someone at home is using plastic generally. So that is a problem. It is already a federal offense to have one of those. And then many states have enacted what they generally call rapid fire trigger activator language. They did that in response to the Las Vegas shooting, which occurred with bump stocks, which again allow an AR-15 to mimic a fully automatic machine gun. And these laws enacted in places like California, Florida has one. They basically regulate anything that can increase a semi-automatic firearm's rate of fire significantly beyond what is typical for the firearm. And that is language that we absolutely support. And we'd be absolutely happy to help provide that language if necessary.
That would be helpful, if you could work with myself and Eric on that, Senator.
Thank you. Just a follow up to the earlier question, and I think it also ties into something Senator Norris mentioned earlier. I think one of the things I'm curious about, maybe if you have any thoughts on it, is the 3-day waiting period as it applies to getting the background check for getting a serial number put on your receiver. Because, I mean, as you described, your receiver is essentially the firearm, the eyes of the court. And what I'm trying to understand is the reasoning if you're already in possession of the receiver, and with my understanding of why you have a 3-day waiting period, I'm not sure I know why it's necessary to have a 3-day waiting period apply to getting the serial number on the receiver. If you have any thoughts on this?
So in a practical matter, when the FFL takes the gun in, they will probably put a serial number on it right then. And then they will initiate the background check as part of when you acquire a firearm, you fill out what's known as a form 4473. That's the put in your address, your information. That's what allows the FFL to initiate the background check. On a 3-day hold like that, 3-day waiting period, they will submit all of that and then hold on to everything. And you come back in 3 days and take possession of it. So if you do that with frames and receivers, it would be the same process. You fill out the paperwork while they put the serial number on it, because you have to include a serial number on that form 4473. So to me, it also tracks with our current background check system. Without 3-day waiting period, you could still be what's called a hold, where the FBI says, we're looking into it, we need more time to see if this person has anything in their history that could prohibit them. So the gun shop will still hold on to the fire for 3 days until the FBI gives it what's known as a proceed.
Now we've switched our law to 7 day, well, it's 7 business days, so 10 calendar days is the max. Right. Yeah.
Ellie, did you have, I'm sorry.
I just one quick, you used the phrase auto sear, and I'm wondering, how do you spell the sear part?
Same way as Senator's last time, SEAR.
Okay.
By the way, Senator Baruth, his part-time job as an English professor.
Yeah, I was just wondering which word, because
Yes,
there
it's,
are 5
so there
sears.
is a component in the trigger mechanisms of a gun. When you pull the trigger, it's called tripping the sear. And that is the component that moves out of the way so the gun can fire essentially.
Got
And
it.
an auto sear,
Just keeps it up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Basically.
Thank you.
Well, now we know.
So
Any other questions for either Greg or Kelly? Kelly, I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
That's okay, Senator.
It's one of those days.
That's okay.
It's very
I'll
cold.
answer
in
questions no
Vermont
matter
today.
what you call me.
Very cold here in Vermont today, and I think it's one of my
A frozen neuron.
frozen neurons causing this problem. Perhaps it's because I'm focused on other things. thank you both very much. It's been very helpful and appreciate your coming here this morning and joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you have any questions that come up after today or later today, I'm happy to field anything you have. I think you know Kendall there.
Yeah.
So anything can go
It'd
through
be
him.
helpful if Kendall is able to make it to our future meetings or someone can view us on YouTube and answer any questions that come up that are in your bailiwick. Very helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank
And,
you.
take a brief break until 20:11. And then come back and pick up with state's attorneys, Marshall Hall and Judge Sunday.